The year is 1547. In the royal chambers of Whitehall Palace, England's most notorious monarch draws his final breath. Henry VIII, the king who tore apart the fabric of European Christianity, who executed two of his own wives, and who left behind a trail of political and personal destruction unlike any ruler in English history, finally succumbs to the consequences of his own excess. But this isn't just the story of a king who died. This is the story of a man whose hunger for power, control, and personal gratification transformed him into something far more dangerous than a mere tyrant. Henry VIII didn't just rule England, he perverted every institution he touched, corrupted the very concept of justice, and turned his personal desires into national policy with consequences that would echo through centuries. Before we dive into this dark chapter of English history, if you're interested in learning more about the hidden truths behind famous historical figures, consider subscribing and letting me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's fascinating how we can explore these centuries-old stories together from all corners of the world. To understand how Henry VIII became the most corrupt monarch in English history, we must first examine the foundation of his character. Born on June 28, 1491, at Greenwich Palace, Henry was never supposed to be king. He was the spare heir, the second son of Henry VII, living in the shadow of his older brother Arthur, Prince of Wales. Arthur was everything a medieval prince should be: scholarly, diplomatic, physically robust, and trained from birth to rule. Henry, by contrast, was indulged, praised for his natural athleticism and charm, but never given the serious political education that would have prepared him for the responsibilities of kingship. This fundamental lack of preparation would prove catastrophic for England. When Arthur died suddenly, in 1502 at age 15, 11-year-old Henry found himself thrust into a role he was psychologically unprepared for. Worse, his father's response was to become increasingly paranoid and controlling, treating Henry not as a future king but as a precious asset to be protected and monitored. The boy who would become England's most notorious monarch spent his teenage years in a gilded cage, his every movement watched, his potential marriages negotiated like business deals, his access to real political power carefully restricted. This childhood created a dangerous psychological profile, a man with unlimited self-regard, but no understanding of consequences, someone who had been told he was special his entire life, but never taught how to channel that specialness into effective leadership. When Henry VII died in 1509, he left behind not a prepared ruler, but a frustrated teenager with the power of absolute monarchy and no moral framework to contain his impulses. Henry's first act as king revealed the pattern that would define his entire reign. Instead of continuing his father's careful financial policies, he immediately began spending the carefully accumulated royal treasury on tournaments, feasts, and displays of magnificence that served no purpose except feeding his own ego. Within 2 years, he had squandered wealth it had taken his father a lifetime to accumulate. But the young king's fiscal irresponsibility was nothing compared to his approach to marriage and diplomacy. His decision to marry Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, was not based on love or political necessity. It was his first exercise in bending the rules to satisfy his personal desires. The marriage required a papal dispensation, as church law prohibited such unions. Henry obtained this dispensation through a combination of political pressure and outright bribery, establishing a pattern of using his royal power to override moral and legal constraints. What made Henry VIII truly dangerous wasn't his personal appetites. Many kings throughout history had been gluttonous, lustful, or cruel. What made Henry uniquely destructive was his systematic perversion of legal and religious institutions to serve his personal whims. He didn't just break the rules, he corrupted the very concept of rules themselves. The first major example of this institutional corruption came with his campaign to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. When the Pope refused to declare his marriage invalid, Henry didn't simply accept defeat or seek a diplomatic solution. Instead, he embarked on a campaign to fundamentally restructure English Christianity, not out of religious conviction, but purely to get his way in a personal matter. The creation of the Church of England was one of the most cynical political maneuvers in European history. Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church, not because he had experienced some religious revelation, but because it was the only way to obtain his desired annulment. He forced the English Parliament to pass the Act of Supremacy in 1534, making it treason to deny his religious authority. Anyone who refused to acknowledge his new role faced death. This wasn't religious reform, it was institutional capture on an unprecedented scale. Henry had literally created his own church so he could make his own rules about marriage and divorce. The human cost was staggering. Thomas More, the brilliant humanist and former Lord Chancellor, was executed for refusing to acknowledge Henry's religious authority. John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, met the same fate. Hundreds of monks, nuns, and religious scholars were killed, imprisoned, or exiled for remaining loyal to their original vows. But Henry's corruption of justice went far deeper than religious persecution. He fundamentally altered the concept of treason to make it easier to eliminate anyone who displeased him. Under previous English law, treason required specific acts against the crown. Henry expanded the definition to include mere words or thoughts. The Treasons Act of 1534 made it a capital offence to maliciously wish, will, or desire by words or writing the death of the king, or to call him a heretic or tyrant. This meant that Henry could execute people not for what they did, but for what they said, or even what they thought. It was a level of thought control that wouldn't be seen again until the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. The king had made himself not just the head of state and church, but the arbiter of truth itself. Henry VIII's treatment of his 6 wives reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his character: his complete inability to see other human beings as anything more than tools for his personal satisfaction. Each marriage followed a similar pattern of manipulation, control, and ultimate disposal when the woman failed to serve his purposes. Catherine of Aragon endured 24 years of marriage to Henry, during which she fulfilled every duty expected of a queen consort. She was intelligent, pious, politically astute, and genuinely popular with the English people. Her only failure was her inability to produce a surviving male heir, a biological outcome over which she had no control. Henry's response was to subject her to years of psychological torture, questioning her virtue, challenging the validity of their marriage, and ultimately having their daughter Mary declared illegitimate. The annulment proceedings against Catherine revealed Henry's capacity for breathtaking cruelty. He forced her to defend her honor in public courts, making her testify about the most intimate details of her first marriage to his brother Arthur. He separated her from her daughter Mary and refused to allow them to see each other during Catherine's final years. When Catherine died in 1536, many suspected poison. though modern historians believe she died of cancer. Either way, Henry's treatment had certainly hastened her end. Anne Boleyn's fate was even more horrific. Henry pursued her for years, writing love letters that revealed his obsessive personality and complete inability to accept rejection. When Anne finally agreed to marry him, she was entering into a relationship with a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way. Anne's pregnancy and the birth of Elizabeth in 1533 should have secured her position, but Henry's expectations were impossible to meet. When she failed to produce a male heir and suffered several miscarriages, Henry's interest began to wane. Worse, Anne had a sharp tongue and independent mind, qualities that had attracted Henry during their courtship but which he found intolerable in a wife. The charges brought against Anne in 1536 were almost certainly fabricated. Adultery with multiple partners, including her own brother, incest, and treason. These accusations were so outrageous that even Henry's own courtiers expressed private doubts. But Henry had decided Anne needed to be eliminated, and he had already demonstrated his willingness to corrupt the justice system to achieve his personal goals. Anne's trial was a mockery of justice. She was not allowed to call witnesses in her defense. The evidence against her was entirely circumstantial, and the judges were handpicked by Henry. Her alleged co-conspirators were tortured until they provided the testimony Henry required. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded at the Tower of London, becoming the first English queen to be executed. The speed with which Henry moved on to Jane Seymour revealed the calculated nature of Anne's destruction. He became engaged to Jane the day after Anne's execution and married her less than 2 weeks later. Jane's primary qualification was her complete malleability. She was quiet, submissive, and unlikely to challenge Henry's authority in any way. Jane's death in 1537, shortly after giving birth to Edward VI, was the only one of Henry's wives' deaths that could be attributed to natural causes. But even here, Henry's character revealed itself. He showed little genuine grief for Jane's death, instead focusing immediately on the political advantages of having finally produced a male heir. Jane was quickly mythologized as Henry's true wife, not because of any deep emotional connection, but because she had fulfilled her biological function and died before she could disappoint him. By the 1530s, Henry had created what was essentially a police state, using the machinery of government to monitor, intimidate, and eliminate anyone who might pose a threat to his authority. The key architect of this system was Thomas Cromwell, who served as Henry's chief minister from 1532 until his own execution in 1540. Cromwell understood that Henry's greatest weakness was his paranoia, and he fed this paranoia systematically to increase his own power and eliminate his enemies. He created networks of informants throughout England, encouraging people to report on their neighbors' conversations about the king. He established procedures for investigating treasonous speech that gave the crown virtually unlimited power to arrest and interrogate anyone. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 provided Henry with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the consequences of opposition. This uprising, which began in Lincolnshire and spread throughout northern England, was fundamentally a religious protest against Henry's dissolution of the monasteries. The rebels were largely peaceful, seeking dialogue rather than violence, and their demands were focused on preserving traditional religious practices rather than challenging royal authority directly. Henry's response revealed his true character. He initially agreed to negotiate, sending representatives to meet with the rebel leaders and promising to consider their grievances. This was pure deception. Henry was simply buying time to gather military forces and identify the rebellion's leaders. Once he had sufficient troops in place, he launched a campaign of unprecedented brutality against the rebels. The suppression of the Pilgrimage of Grace involved mass executions across northern England. Henry ordered that the bodies of executed rebels be displayed throughout the region as a warning to others. Entire families were destroyed for the crime of participating in peaceful protests. The abbot of Jervaux was hanged despite having taken no part in the rebellion, simply because Henry suspected he might have sympathized with the rebels' religious goals. Robert Aske, the rebellion's primary leader, was promised safe conduct for negotiations with the king. Henry violated this promise, having Aske arrested and executed in particularly gruesome fashion. He was hanged in chains from the walls of York Castle, left to die slowly of starvation and exposure as a warning to anyone who might consider challenging royal authority. The message was unmistakable. Henry would not tolerate even peaceful opposition to his policies. He had created a kingdom where loyalty was measured not by service to England, but by absolute submission to his personal will. The dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541 is often portrayed as a religious reform, but the reality was far more cynical. Henry's primary motivation was financial. The crown was essentially bankrupt due to his extravagant spending, and the monasteries represented the largest concentration of wealth in England outside the royal treasury. The systematic destruction of monastic communities represents one of the largest acts of cultural vandalism in English history. Monasteries had served for centuries as centers of learning, charity, and agricultural innovation. They maintained libraries, schools, and hospitals, providing social services that the royal government was unwilling or unable to provide. Henry's commissioners, led by Thomas Cromwell, conducted what can only be described as a campaign of institutional theft. They seized not just the monetary wealth of the monasteries, but also their lands, buildings, artwork, and manuscripts. Priceless illuminated texts were destroyed or sold for their precious metal content. Libraries accumulated over centuries were scattered or burned. Architectural masterpieces were demolished for their building materials. The human cost was equally devastating. Thousands of monks, nuns, and lay brothers were rendered homeless and pensionless. The charitable functions of the monasteries, feeding the poor, caring for the sick, providing education, simply disappeared in most communities. Henry made no provision for replacing these social services, leaving the most vulnerable members of English society without support. The economic impact extended far beyond the religious communities themselves. Monasteries had been major employers, providing work for craftsmen, farmers, and laborers throughout England. Their dissolution created unemployment and economic disruption that contributed to social unrest for decades. Henry's defenders argue that some monastic wealth was used to establish new educational institutions, such as the refounding of several colleges at Cambridge and Oxford. But the vast majority of the seized wealth was used to fund Henry's military adventures and court extravagances. The King's College Chapel at Cambridge, often cited as an example of Henry's cultural patronage, was actually begun by Henry VII and represented a tiny fraction of the wealth Henry extracted from the monasteries. By the 1540s, Henry had become a grotesque caricature of kingship, a bloated and paranoid tyrant whose court had become a place of constant fear and surveillance. His physical deterioration mirrored his moral decay. Once athletic and charismatic, he had become enormously obese, suffered from painful leg ulcers that may have been symptoms of diabetes, and displayed increasing signs of mental instability. His marriage to Anne of Cleves in 1540 lasted only 6 months, but its failure revealed Henry's complete inability to accept responsibility for his mistakes. He had agreed to the marriage based on a flattering portrait by Hans Holbein, but when Anne arrived in England, Henry claimed he found her physically repulsive. Rather than acknowledging his own superficiality or attempting to make the marriage work for diplomatic reasons, he immediately began seeking an annulment. Anne of Cleves was perhaps the luckiest of Henry's wives because she was intelligent enough to cooperate with his desire for an annulment and humble enough not to challenge his authority. She agreed to the divorce, accepted a generous settlement, and lived quietly in England for the rest of her life. Her survival was largely due to her willingness to become invisible and make no demands on Henry's attention or conscience. The execution of Thomas Cromwell in 1540 demonstrated that even Henry's most loyal servants were expendable when they outlived their usefulness. Cromwell had served Henry faithfully for nearly a decade, implementing policies that many found morally reprehensible, but which had greatly increased royal power and wealth. His reward was a trumped-up charge of treason and a brutal execution. Cromwell's fall was engineered by the Duke of Norfolk and other conservative nobles who resented his low birth and reformist policies. But Henry's willingness to sacrifice his most effective minister for temporary political advantage showed that he had learned nothing about the importance of loyal and competent advisors. He would repeat this pattern throughout his final years, elevating and then destroying ministers with bewildering frequency. His marriage to Catherine Howard in 1540 revealed Henry at his most delusional. Catherine was barely 20 when she married the obese, ulcerated, psychologically unstable king who was now approaching 50. Henry convinced himself that this young woman was genuinely attracted to him, despite the obvious impossibility of any real romantic connection between them. Catherine's execution in 1542 was perhaps Henry's most inexcusable act of judicial murder. Unlike Anne Boleyn, whose charges were at least theoretically possible, if entirely unproven, Catherine Howard was executed essentially for having had relationships before her marriage to Henry. Her treason consisted of failing to inform Henry about her previous romantic experiences and possibly continuing a relationship with Thomas Culpeper after her marriage. The evidence against Catherine Howard was so thin that Parliament had to change the law retroactively to make her actions treasonous. Henry literally created new crimes in order to execute his fifth wife. Catherine was barely 21 when she was beheaded, a young woman whose greatest error was being attractive enough to catch the attention of a monster. Henry's sixth and final marriage to Catherine Parr in 1543 provides the clearest insight into what it actually meant to be married to the most dangerous man in England. Catherine was a twice-widowed intellectual with genuine religious convictions and strong opinions about theology and politics. Under normal circumstances, these qualities would have made her completely unsuitable as Henry's wife. Catherine's survival required a level of psychological sophistication and strategic thinking that her predecessors had lacked. She understood that Henry's ego was simultaneously his greatest strength and his fatal weakness. She learned to flatter him intellectually while never challenging his authority, to engage with his theological interests while never contradicting his religious positions, and to show maternal care for his children while never appearing to compete with his own parental authority. The most dangerous moment in Catherine's marriage came in 1546, when conservative courtiers, led by Stephen Gardiner and the Duke of Norfolk, attempted to turn Henry against her by suggesting she held heretical religious views. Catherine had indeed been reading and discussing Reformed theology, activities that could easily be construed as treasonous under Henry's religious laws. When Henry showed signs of turning against her, Catherine employed a strategy of such calculated humility that it bordered on psychological manipulation. She approached Henry with tears and protestations of feminine weakness, claiming that any theological discussions she had engaged in were merely attempts to learn from his superior wisdom. She positioned herself not as an independent thinker, but as a student seeking enlightenment from her husband's greater understanding. This performance satisfied Henry's need for intellectual superiority while diffusing the threat her genuine scholarship posed to his authority. Catherine had essentially saved her life by pretending to be stupider and less capable than she actually was, a survival strategy that revealed the impossible position of any intelligent woman in Henry's court. Catherine's careful management of Henry's psychology extended to her relationship with his children. She had to show maternal care for Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, while never appearing to challenge Henry's role as their father or his authority over their futures. This required a delicate balance, being supportive enough to win the children's affection and Henry's approval, but not so influential that she might be seen as a threat to royal succession. When Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, he left behind a country that had been fundamentally corrupted by his reign. The institutions of government, law, and religion had all been perverted to serve one man's personal desires, and the psychological damage to English political culture would last for generations. The immediate succession crisis revealed the chaos Henry had created through his marital manipulations. Edward VI was only 9 years old when he became king, and his legitimacy was constantly questioned due to the circumstances of Henry's break with Rome. Mary and Elizabeth had both been declared illegitimate and then restored to the succession according to Henry's shifting political needs, creating uncertainty about the validity of their claims to the throne. The religious settlement Henry had imposed was equally unstable. The Church of England existed primarily as a vehicle for royal authority rather than as a coherent theological system. Henry had maintained Catholic theology while rejecting papal authority, creating a religious structure that satisfied neither genuine Catholics nor committed Protestants. This religious confusion would plague England for decades, contributing to civil conflict and persecution under both Mary I and Elizabeth I. The economic damage was equally severe. Henry had squandered the accumulated wealth of centuries, not just his own inherited treasury, but also the seized assets of the monasteries. England emerged from his reign essentially bankrupt, with a debased currency and no coherent fiscal policy. The social services previously provided by monastic communities had disappeared, creating poverty and social disruption that would take generations to address. Perhaps most damaging was the psychological legacy of Henry's reign. He had demonstrated that absolute power, unchecked by moral or legal constraints, inevitably corrupts those who wield it. His courtiers had learned to survive through flattery, betrayal, and the careful management of a tyrant's ego. These lessons in political manipulation and moral compromise would shape English court culture for decades to come. The international reputation Henry had destroyed would also take generations to restore. European powers had watched in horror as Henry systematically eliminated his wives, persecuted religious minorities, and violated every diplomatic agreement that became inconvenient. England emerged from his reign as an unreliable ally and a cautionary example of monarchical excess. Any honest assessment of Henry VIII's reign must account for the human lives destroyed by his policies and personal decisions. The traditional focus on his 6 wives, while important, represents only a tiny fraction of the suffering he caused. The execution toll alone is staggering. Modern historians estimate that Henry was responsible for approximately 70,000 executions during his 38-year reign, a rate of nearly 5 deaths per day. These numbers include not just famous victims like Thomas More and Anne Boleyn, but thousands of ordinary people who were killed for religious dissent, political opposition, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The pilgrimage of grace suppression alone cost approximately 200 lives, including not just the rebellion's leaders, but also many participants who had been promised pardons. The dissolution of the monasteries displaced thousands of religious personnel and eliminated the livelihoods of countless lay workers. The ongoing religious persecution throughout Henry's reign created a climate of fear that affected every level of English society. Women suffered disproportionately under Henry's rule. Beyond his wives, countless women were accused of adultery, heresy, or treason based on the expanded definitions Henry had created. The case of Catherine Howard demonstrated that even royal women could be executed for sexual behavior that would have been overlooked in men. Lower-class women accused of similar crimes faced imprisonment, public humiliation, or death without even the limited protections of royal status. The destruction of educational and cultural institutions represents another form of human cost that is difficult to quantify. The manuscripts destroyed, the artistic treasures melted down for their precious metal content, the schools closed, and the libraries scattered represent centuries of human intellectual achievement that was lost forever to feed Henry's immediate financial needs. The story of Henry VIII serves as a powerful reminder that individual moral failure, when combined with absolute power, can have consequences that extend far beyond one person's lifetime. Henry was not born a monster. He was created by a combination of psychological dysfunction, unlimited authority, and a political system that provided no effective checks on royal power. Understanding how Henry became what he was doesn't excuse his actions, but it does provide valuable lessons about the importance of institutional constraints on political power. The modern constitutional systems that emerged in England and other democracies were designed specifically to prevent the kind of personal rule that Henry VIII represented. Henry's reign also demonstrates the particular danger of leaders who conflate their personal desires with national interests. His ability to convince himself that his marriages, divorces, and religious policies were motivated by concern for England rather than personal gratification shows how easily self-interest can masquerade as public service when power is unchecked. The survival strategies employed by people like Catherine Parr and Anne of Cleves reveal the psychological sophistication required to navigate relationships with dangerous authority figures. Their experiences provide insight into how ordinary people can protect themselves and others when confronted with abusive power structures. Perhaps most importantly, Henry VIII's story illustrates the resilience of human institutions and values. Despite 38 years of systematic corruption and abuse, English society eventually recovered from his reign. The very fact that we can now examine his actions critically and condemn them morally demonstrates that tyranny, however absolute it may seem in the moment, ultimately cannot destroy the human capacity for justice and moral reasoning. The mystery of Henry VIII is not really about his personal psychology or sexual behavior. It's about how a political system can produce and sustain such devastating leadership. By understanding how Henry's reign became possible, we can better recognize and prevent similar concentrations of dangerous power in our own time. Henry VIII died believing he was one of England's greatest kings. History has judged him very differently, remembering him instead as a cautionary tale about the corruption of power and the importance of moral constraints on political authority. His true legacy is not the temporary expansion of royal power he achieved, but the lasting lesson about why such power must never again be allowed to rest in the hands of a single individual, no matter how charismatic or initially promising they may appear. The royal physician who attended Henry's death in 1547 could not have imagined that this king's most lasting contribution to history would be serving as an example of everything a ruler should never become. But that is perhaps the most fitting end to the story of England's most perverted king, remembered not for his achievements, but as a warning about the human capacity for corruption when power knows no limits and faces no consequences. In the end, Henry VIII got the immortality he craved, but not the kind he wanted. He is remembered not as a great king, but as a great cautionary tale, a reminder that the price of unchecked power is always paid by those least able to bear it. His story serves as an eternal warning about the importance of limiting authority, protecting the vulnerable, and never allowing personal desires to masquerade as public policy. The mystery of Henry VIII is solved not by examining his private psychological motivations, but by understanding the public systems that enabled his private pathologies to become national disasters. His reign stands as proof that no individual, regardless of birth, talent, or initial promise, should ever be trusted with the kind of absolute authority that England granted to its Tudor king. History's judgment of Henry VIII is final and unforgiving. He was indeed the most perverted king in English history, not because of his sexual behavior, but because of his systematic perversion of justice, law, religion, and human dignity in service of his own uncontrolled appetites for power and personal gratification. His true legacy is the lesson that such perversion of authority must never be allowed to happen again.